Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be with you virtually. I hope you can all hear me. Wave a hand if you can't, and I hope to see...
Wonderful, perfect.
All good, and I hope to see a few of you in the picture when it's Q&A. I'm hearing my own boasting back at me. So I'm speaking to you from Prague. 30 years ago, I was here witnessing the Velvet Revolution, which saw the end of communism in Prague. And one evening, walking back to my hotel, actually the hotel I'm speaking to you from, I saw a graffito on the wall which said, "The heart of Europe cries for freedom." The heart of Europe being obviously, in their view, Prague. There are some competitors for that title. At the same time, the motto of the revolution was the return to Europe. Now stop and think about that for a moment. We're the heart of Europe, but we want to return to Europe. How can that be? Is the heart then outside the body? Does the heart need to return to the body? So what I want to start by doing is exploring the complexity of what we mean by Europe. So Professor Wessels at the beginning gave you a very good account of the complexity of what we mean by narratives. The title of this series is Narratives of Europe, Narratives for Europe. But what on earth do we mean by Europe? Well, by Europe we can mean at least three different kinds of things. First of all, a geographical expression. Secondly, some sort of a political organization. And thirdly, some sort of an idea or ideal. So first of all, the geographical expression. It's actually one of the oldest geographical expressions in recorded history. The earliest cartographers divided the world into Europe, Asia, and Libya, which then became Africa. But at the same time, it's a geographical expression with very unclear frontiers. Where does this Europe end? Actually, the only clear frontier of Europe is in the north. It ends at the North Pole. That I think we can say with confidence. In the east, there is no clear dividing line. There's the arbitrary line of the Urals, but actually Europe merely fades away across the vast expanse of Russia and of Turkey. In the south, there's also no clear divide. For the Romans and for the Greeks, the Mediterranean world was at the heart of European civilization. And it's an extremely arbitrary statement to say to Morocco, as the European community did, you may not join, you may not even apply to join because you're not a European country. Kindly explain to me why Morocco is definitely not a European country, but Turkey definitely is. And then in the West, if we talk about Europe as a community of values, of shared history, culture, political system, well, Canada is a perfect member of the European Union. So actually only in the north does this geographical expression have a clear divide, and the absurdity in a sense of that divide is illustrated by a good friend of mine who lives in Istanbul and teaches at Sabancı University, which is the other side of the Bosphorus. So as she says, I commute from Europe to Asia and back again every day. But that's only one Europe. Then there's Europe as a political organization. Now in this series you've essentially been talking, so far as I can see from what I watched, about the European Union. But of course there's also the Council of Europe, which predates the European Union. There's the OSCE, which extends to include Russia, United States, Canada, and Kazakhstan. There's NATO, which got a mention. In the Eurovision Song Contest, which some of you may watch, we even have Australia. UEFA for football. So there are many different organizational definitions of Europe. Of course, the core one is now the European Union, but let's not forget the others. And then there's a third sense of Europe, which is as an idea or an ideal. There is no other continent for which there is so much literature about the idea of Europe or the ideal of Europe. I will never forget talking to Bronisław Geremek, who some of you will know was a great figure of the Polish democratic opposition of the Solidarity movement, actually the Polish foreign minister who signed Poland's accession to NATO. And he once turned to me in the corridors of the Polish parliament and stopped and said, "You know, for me, Europe is something like a Platonic essence." Of what other continent would anyone say that? There's a lot of literature about how Europe is understood as an ideal and an idea to which we're still aspiring. Now, that's already complicated enough, but let me make it even more complicated. Rather than simplifying as you asked me to, let me complicate it still further. So far as I understand what you have been hearing, you've been hearing the story mainly from different member states of the European Union and from one accession country, namely Serbia. There's actually, if you want to pursue this, a very good book edited by my Oxford colleague Calypso Nicolaides and Justine Lacroix from the Free University of Belgium, called European Stories, published by OUP, which explores in depth all those different national narratives. But why define the unit as the state? What about all the different languages of Europe? Language is an essential component of identity. Language is what makes our national identities. What about all the different minorities in Europe which have no state? The Roma, for example. And then what about each individual? The truth is that every single one of us, every single one of you in this room has your own Europe. Tell me your Europe and I will tell you who you are. Right? And then what about the countries that consider themselves to be historically, geographically, culturally in Europe, but are outside the European Union? You've just heard from Professor Misiewicz very eloquently, and I couldn't agree more with her critique of Macron, who actually goes back to an old Enlightenment stereotype in which the true Europe is really Western Europe, and Eastern Europe as a whole is some sort of exotic and faintly barbaric area. And his refusal to even think about further enlargement is, I think, lamentable, because the fact is, some of the most enthusiastic Europeans of all are to be found in the countries that consider themselves European, but are not yet in the European Union. Right? This was true in the Cold War, when the greatest pro-European enthusiasm was in places like Prague and Budapest and Warsaw. I used to say at that time that Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain between those who have Europe in the West and those who believe in it in the East. One of the most enthusiastic pro-European demonstrations I have ever seen was in the Maidan in Kiev in Ukraine. We want to belong to that Europe. So what about that perspective? Why are we excluding that perspective from our inquiry into what the European narrative is? But I go even further than that. What about the perspective from the rest of the world? And in particular, from all those countries, and that's most of them, which experienced European colonialism, formal or informal, one way or another, as Europe went out and one way or another colonized much of the world. We did a big project in this, a project at Oxford, a big conference which, in this project which Dr. Müller mentioned, and the most devastating sessions were by the people from Turkey, from Egypt, from India, from outside the European Union. And the story they told us was so different from the story we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves a fairy tale about how Europe is promoting and advancing and spreading our European values of rule of law, democracy, human rights, openness, tolerance, pluralism. We tell the story of how we're trying to bring down frontiers. If you look at it from their point of view, Europe is about building up frontiers. We're now asking the countries of Maghreb to secure their southern frontiers, to keep out the migrants who would otherwise come to us. We tell them a story about democracy and human rights. What they see is British, French, German, and Italian arms sales to the dictators in the Middle East, soaring, going up and up, and of course those arms are also used to repress their own people. So it's really important for us to see how we look to others. Identity, after all, has always got two sides. It's how I think about myself, but also how others see me. I may think of myself as the world's greatest footballer, but if others don't see me that way, I'm probably not. And so if we take into account the European stories and narratives from outside, we have and think that every individual has his or her own narrative, you end up with 5 or 6 billion Europes, right? And in some sense that is genuine the case. Most people on this planet have some mental map, some idea of Europe. So diversity, complexity, I've added to that complexity and diversity, and add again to that the fact that in any given group, you've heard it already many times, narratives of Europe are always contested. So you've heard about how they're contested inside Hungary, or inside the Czech Republic, or inside Britain, dramatically in the case of the Brexit referendum. They're also contested on the European level. Professor Kirali from Budapest mentioned the Paris Declaration, the Europe we can believe in, which is a very conservative vision of Europe. Put that against the Manifesto for a European Republic, produced by Robert Manas, the Austrian writer, and Ulrike Göro. You have two completely different visions of what Europe should be. So now, take our motto, the motto of the European Union, united in diversity. Professor Wessels mentioned it at the beginning. Well, we can see the diversity, but where is the unity? So let me now try and proceed from the complexity and the cacophony to try and pull out some common threads. And the first and very simple point to make is, you have an interesting title, Narratives of Europe, Narratives for Europe. Narratives of Europe has to take into account all that complexity that I've just talked about. Narratives for Europe, we can make a radical simplification and say, since narratives specifically often have as their object a political community, it's a narrative of the French nation or the British nation or the German nation or whoever it might be, or the narrative of the United States, we're going to reduce this and say this is the narrative for the European Union. And that's a step that you've made implicitly in many of these lectures, but let me make it explicit. Now, that already simplifies matters greatly. Now, if you want to know how not to go looking for and claim that you have found a new narrative for the European Union, you can go online and look up New Narrative for Europe. This was a project of the European Commission and the European Parliament, started under the commission of José Manuel Barroso, which was indeed looking for this new European narrative. It started, I think, in 2013, ran for a few years, and it's a classic example of how not to do it. Top down, Brussels out, trying to find desperately in double quick time precisely what Dr. Müller asked for, a single simple narrative. And the result had very little impact, justifiably, because the result is an extremely waffly a declaration, manifesto, Europe, it says, in a state of mind, drafted by a committee, getting nowhere, speaking to no one, and suffering from this painful gap between the rhetoric of the European Union and the reality, as seen by minorities and people who are doing badly inside the European Union or people outside the European Union. There's also, and I go to this point now, when we talk about narrative, we have to ask the question, is it a phenomenon or an epiphenomenon? That is to say, is narrative merely a reflection of what is happening or what we're doing, or is it itself part of that action? Is it representation or is it action? Do or say? And the answer is that it's a bit of both. That a country like the United States, which has a strong narrative, the city on the hill, the founding fathers, the beacon of freedom, that powerful narrative reinforces certain tendencies in that society and is itself reinforced by them, so long as rhetoric and reality don't go too far apart. When rhetoric and reality go too far apart, you no longer have that virtuous circle between representation and action, between narrative and policy. So we have to find a narrative which is close enough to what people want the European Union to do and what the European Union is actually doing. A story that links past, present and future. So this brings us to our Oxford project. Our Oxford project, which you can find online, is called Europe Stories, has precisely the opposite approach to that from Brussels in the so-called New Narrative for Europe. We turn it round. Instead of starting with the question, what stories should Europe tell, we ask the question, what stories does Europe tell? And what we're currently doing is digging down and trying to gather and understand what stories Europe, in all its complexity and diversity, does tell from below. We're doing a whole series of interviews. If any of you would like to contribute, do please come on the Dahrendorf Program for the Study of Freedom website, Dahrendorf Program for the Study of Freedom, Dahrendorf spelled as in Ralph Dahrendorf. Find the website and there's an email address, and if you would like to be interviewed by our team, who are people of your age, they're mainly students, graduate students, let us know. Because we want to start by listening to you, and in particular by listening to your generation. Because after all, it's going to be you who are going to have to keep the European Union going, improve it and deepen it for the next however many decades. Now, what's going to come out of that initially is a cacophony, right? A tremendous discordant sound like walking through Piccadilly Circus. The question is whether in that cacophony we can detect some polyphony. That is to say, themes, melodies, tunes that somehow recur across many different countries, many different groups, across different generations. And out of that polyphony, we can weave a new version of the European story. Now, you may think that's impossible. I would argue that from the 1950s to the 1990s, we actually had precisely that kind of polyphony. So if you look at the way the narrative for Europe, the pro-European integration story, was told across the whole continent of Europe, at first glance, they look very different indeed. But when you look closer, you discover that they have the same basic form. And the basic form was this, and this actually connects to something that Professor Misiewicz mentioned in talking about the very, very difficult and bloody past of former Yugoslavia in the 1990s and looking to Europe today. The form of the pro-European argument from the 1950s to the 1990s in so many different European countries was, we have been in a bad place, we want to be in a better place, and that better place is called Europe. So I repeat, we've been in a bad place, we want to be in a better place, and that place is called Europe. There was no shortage of bad places, each of them different. For Germany, it was the shame and humiliation and guilt of the Nazi dictatorship. For France, it was a story of occupation, defeat, collaboration. For Britain, it was relative economic and political decline. For Spain and Portugal and Greece, it was fascist dictatorships. For Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the countries of Eastern Europe, it was communist dictatorship. Europe had no shortage of bad places, but the basic shape of the argument was always the same. Been in that bad place, want to be in a better one, that place is Europe. Hence, in this city, in Prague in 1989, the return to Europe. The problem comes when you've arrived, right? It's great traveling, hopefully, but when you've arrived, you're in it. Well, first of all, the reality is always less pleasing than the dream, right? The reality of being inside the European Union is more disappointing. We now have a whole generation, roughly speaking your generation, I'm guessing, who've known nothing but a Europe largely composed of liberal democracies, most of them, though not all, in the EU and NATO, the former Yugoslavia being, of course, a notable exception in this picture, and Ukraine, one has to add, who in some sense may take it for granted that we have this Europe whole and free. What is more, if you're a young Spaniard or Portuguese or Greek, I don't know if there are any of you in the room or listening online, watching online, the curve goes exactly the other way. The curve was an upward curve, right, towards a better future in Europe. If you're a young Spaniard or Portuguese or Greek, 15 years ago, in the early 2000s, you and your country may have been in a much better place before the eurozone crisis hit and produced such dramatic and painful suffering, particularly for young people, up to 50% youth unemployment in southern Europe, forcing many people who'd been doing advanced studies to go and work as waiters in Berlin or London or wherever. So you've been in a better place, you're now in a worse place, and it's Europe that is partly to blame. So that's a real challenge that we have, that Europe is no longer a future perfect, it's a lived reality. What do we do in that situation? Let me share two last thoughts with you and then come to a close and invite your questions. Because European integration started as the attempt to create something that had never existed before, something new in history, starting in the 1940s, early 1950s, its foundational rhetoric was inevitably about moving towards some better tomorrow. It was teleological. It was looking to the future. And we got so into the habit of having that rhetoric, and I talked about the shape of the European argument, that we're still using that rhetoric today. Quick example. In the latest European elections, the Green Party in Germany had a campaign slogan, I'll give it to you first in German, Perfekt ist Europa nicht, aber ein verdammt guter Staat. Europe is not perfect, but it's a damn good start. Now, think about that for a moment and put the name of your own country instead of Europe. France is not perfect, but it's a damn good start. Germany is not perfect, but it's a damn good start. Poland is not perfect, but it's a damn good start. That's not what we say about our own countries. Our own countries exist as mature political communities with their own history and culture and traditions. We like some of them, we dislike others of them, but we want to preserve what's good about them. Well, the European Union, if you trace it back to the Treaty of Rome, is older than many of the states in Europe. Most of the states in Eastern and Southeastern Europe are much younger than the European Union. So why are we still talking about it as if it's something that's only to be placed in an ideal future? Don't you, and think about this, don't you value the European Union for what it is today, for the freedom it gives you to wake up on a Friday morning, jump on a budget airline flight, fly to one end of the continent to the other, meet someone there, settle down, live, work, study, love from one end of the continent to the other, most of the time still being in the same political, economic and security community. That's an extraordinary achievement. It is, I would assert quite calmly, the best Europe we've ever had. So there is now a conservative, small c conservative, realistic argument. Frankly, if we just succeeded in maintaining and preserving the European Union we have today for the next 20 years, that would be a great achievement, because believe me, it's threatened. So that's point number one. Let's not stop talking about it as some imperfect attempt at some idealized future. Let's think about it as something we want to preserve because we quite like it as it is. Second new argument is about what you wanted to do, and maybe in question time you can tell me what you wanted to do, or in those interviews I've mentioned. But if we talk to young Europeans today, there are some things that they desperately want to do. First of all, climate change is the global challenge of our time. The fact is, if we don't act much more radically, we are heading towards more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, and at that point the climate scientists tell us that it's quite likely that global warming becomes irreversible. So there's a huge challenge out there of climate change, of us threatening life on Earth. We are living through the second phase of the digital revolution, moving towards artificial intelligence, which is going to transform our lives as much as the internet has, give us sentient, conscious beings who will not be human beings. That's a vast challenge also for us to meet, and can only be met at the global level. And thirdly, and I'm just giving 3 examples, we are living through something none of us have lived through since the late 18th century, which is a hegemonic shift, a great power shift. So a shift from one great power to another, or at least an emergent rivalry between 2 great powers. It happened between Britain and the United States in the course of the Second World War, but that was a great exception because Britain and the United States had so much in common in culture and history and tradition that we managed to do it peacefully. Normally in history, these transitions are accompanied by great tension, conflict, and war. Now we are experiencing the emergence of a new superpower, a non-Western superpower, China. It was interesting that Professor Mishkevich mentioned that it's the Chinese who give the loans for building the roads, even in Europe. And there is already, you've seen it on your television screens, a trade war between China and the United States. Some would argue there's even something like a Cold War between China and the United States. That's immensely dangerous for us all. For all three of these issues, you need the scale, the size, the clout that only the European Union can give us. Otherwise, the biggest European country is a small country. Germany, France, Britain, we're all small countries on a global scale. So that we need, in a world of giants and giant challenges, to be a giant ourselves. The challenge here, of course, is how to do that, because that narrative cannot be plausible unless the European Union is actually doing the stuff it takes to meet those challenges. So those are just two thoughts, the let's value and preserve what we have, and the new narrative about global challenges and being a giant in the world of giants, which I think can be helpful in thinking about a new narrative for the European Union. Let me conclude by coming back to Prague, where just a couple of weeks ago there was another huge demonstration like the one we saw in 1989. It was led by your generation, by students. It had a YouTuber and a rapper, and its great subject was, we want a Czech Republic which is worthy of its place in Europe, and we want a European Union which defends European values inside its member states, which does not allow EU funds to be used in corrupt fashion by a former oligarch who is now the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Mr. Babiš. That's, of course, a claim, but there's a good deal of evidence that points in that direction. And the demonstration of 250,000 people was a sea of European flags, like what I saw on the Maidan in Kiev in the Orange Revolution. So I think there is really hope that faced with this crisis, faced with this challenge, Europe will renew itself and find a new narrative, but it's going to be up to your generation to tell us what you want the EU to do and what story you want the European Union to tell. And with that I conclude and look forward to hearing your questions.